A strict teacher, a forgotten piano, a setup meant to humiliate. But when Charlie Henderson placed his fingers on the keys, he shattered every stereotype in that classroom. This is the moment they never saw coming. Charlie Henderson sat by the window, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk, not out of nerves but habit. It was something his mother always told him to stop doing, but he found it helped him focus. The eighth grade classroom at Roosevelt Middle School in Birmingham, Alabama, buzzed with the usual pre-lesson chatter. Some kids laughed, others whispered, but Charlie kept his attention on the worksheet in front of him. He liked getting things done early. At the front of the room, Mrs. Beatrice Langley adjusted her reading glasses and flipped through her lesson plan. She had been teaching history for over 20 years, building a reputation for being strict but fair. At least that's what people said. But fairness depended on who you were. Charlie had learned that the hard way. It was never obvious. She never raised her voice, never outright insulted him. But the signs were always there. When Charlie raised his hand, she rarely called on him. When he answered correctly, she would move on quickly, barely acknowledging it. But if he got something wrong, she lingered, drawing out the moment just long enough for it to feel like a lesson, not just for him, but for everyone watching. And Charlie wasn't the only one who noticed. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," Trevor Whitman, the kid sitting next to him, whispered one afternoon. "You got, like, teacher invisibility or something." Charlie had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But today felt different. Mrs. Langley glanced his way more than usual, not in a way that signaled trouble, but something else: anticipation. The lesson began, a typical discussion about the Civil War, a subject Charlie already knew well. He took notes, listening, waiting for the usual pattern to repeat. She would call on someone else. She always did. Then something unexpected happened. "Charlie," Mrs. Langley's voice cut through the room. Heads turned. Charlie blinked. She never called on him. He sat up a little straighter, glancing at the board. The question was simple. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. His voice was steady. The answer was perfect. A few students exchanged glances. Trevor shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" Mrs. Langley pursed her lips. Not bad." Then just as quickly she moved on. But Charlie knew something had shifted. She wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching. And later, just before the bell rang, she made her move. "Charlie," she said as students began packing up. "Stay behind for a moment." A few kids glanced back, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Charlie took his time putting his notebook away, then slowly approached her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, clasping her hands together, "about your grandfather." Charlie frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." Something about her tone made the air feel heavier. He nodded. "Yeah, he was a pianist, played jazz." Mrs. Langley's lips curled just slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close. "Interesting." She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping against the desk. "You must have picked up a thing or two." Charlie hesitated. "Where is this going?" "A little," he admitted. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Good to know." The bell rang. Charlie grabbed his bag, turning toward the door. But just as he reached it, her voice stopped him. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice sharp. "Let's see what you've got." Charlie turned back. "What?" She gestured toward the old dust-covered upright piano sitting in the back of the room, untouched for years. "You'll play something for the class." A few remaining students paused near the doorway, eyes flicking between them. "Why?" Charlie asked. Mrs. Langley tilted her head, like the question amused her. "Why not?" Charlie knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. She thought he would mess up. She wanted him to fail. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that she had just made a mistake. Charlie Henderson walked home that afternoon with a feeling he couldn't quite shake. The words, "Let's see what you've got," echoed in his mind over and over. Mrs. Langley wasn't giving him an opportunity. She was setting him up. He had seen that smirk before. The way she looked at him, not with curiosity, but with expectation. She expected him to fail. As he turned onto his street, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. The neighborhood was quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the distant sound of a car radio playing blues from a porch down the block. Music had always been a part of his world. By the time he stepped into his house, the scent of fried chicken and cornbread filled the air. His mother stood at the stove, humming softly. "You're home late," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah," Charlie muttered, dropping his backpack by the door. His mother turned off the burner and wiped her hands on a dish towel before sitting across from him at the table. "Something on your mind?" Charlie hesitated. Then he told her. Everything. Mrs. Langley. The challenge. The way the whole class had stared at him like they were waiting for a show. His mother didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression shifting from curiosity to something quieter. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, studying him. "And how do you feel about that?" Charlie exhaled. "Like she thinks I'll mess up. Like she wants me to." His mother nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the table. "You know, when people like her don't see you, they think they already know you. Know what you can and can't do." Charlie stayed quiet. "She doesn't think you belong in her world," his mother continued. "But tomorrow you're going to make sure she knows she was wrong." Charlie let those words settle. He already knew what he was going to do. That night he sat at the small, upright piano in the corner of the living room, the one that had belonged to his grandfather. The wood was worn, the keys slightly chipped, but the sound was warm, rich, alive. His fingers hovered over the keys. He wasn't just going to play, he was going to make them listen. The next morning, Roosevelt Middle School felt different. Word had traveled. Whispers followed Charlie as he walked through the hallways. "You think he can actually play? Mrs. Langley set him up for this? Man, this is gonna be embarrassing." Charlie ignored it. As he slid into his seat, Trevor leaned over. "Dude, you really gonna do this?" Charlie didn't look up from his notebook. "Guess we'll see." Then Mrs. Langley walked in, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her presence as sharp as ever. She barely acknowledged the students settling in. Instead, she looked directly at Charlie, a satisfied little nod as she set her books down. Charlie met her gaze unblinking. She still thought she was in control, but by the end of the day, she wouldn't be. That night, Charlie Henderson lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across his room. Sleep wasn't coming easy. Mrs. Langley thought she had him cornered. The way she had smirked, the way her words had dripped with something that wasn't encouragement, but something else. Expectation. Not an expectation of success, but of failure. She expected him to hesitate, to stumble, to prove whatever it was she already believed about him. But she didn't know the full story. Charlie turned onto his side, listening to the distant hum of cars passing outside, the occasional bark of a dog. He wasn't nervous. Not really. It wasn't fear sitting heavy in his chest. It was something deeper. Frustration. Why did she pick him? Not Trevor. Not one of the kids she always favored. No, she chose the quiet black boy in the back of the room, the one she barely acknowledged unless there was a mistake to highlight. She wanted a moment, a lesson. Charlie clenched his jaw. She was going to get one. He sat up, throwing off the covers. The hardwood floor was cool under his feet as he walked out of his room and into the dimly lit living room. The old upright piano sat in the corner, its wood worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to his grandfather once, a man who had played in jazz clubs across New Orleans, filling smoky rooms with music so rich, so full of soul, that people stopped what they were doing just to listen. Charlie had spent years sitting beside him, watching, learning, feeling the music rather than just playing it. He ran his fingers over the keys. They felt familiar, like home. Then he played, not for practice, not to prove anything, just to feel the music. A slow, rolling blues progression filled the house, drifting into the night like a story being told in a language only a few could truly understand. His fingers moved effortlessly, each note carrying weight, emotion, history. His mother's voice drifted from her bedroom. "You all right, baby?" Charlie didn't stop playing. "Yeah." A pause, then a soft chuckle. "She doesn't know what she's in for, does she?" Charlie smiled to himself. "Nope." He played for another hour, letting the music settle deep in his bones. Tomorrow wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about making them all listen. The next morning, when Charlie walked into Roosevelt Middle School, he didn't look nervous. He wasn't walking into a trap. He was walking into a stage. The air inside Roosevelt Middle School's history classroom felt heavier than usual. The usual chatter was there, but it wasn't the same. It was filled with whispers, speculation, anticipation. Charlie Henderson sat at his desk, his hands folded over his notebook, his expression unreadable. He could feel eyes on him. Some kids were waiting for a disaster. Others were just there for the spectacle. Mrs. Langley had made sure of that. She stood at the front of the room adjusting her reading glasses, her usual air of control wrapped tightly around her like armor. She thought she was in charge of this moment, but she wasn't. "Well," she said, closing her book and glancing at the clock, "we have a little time before we move on." "Perfect." She turned toward the old upright piano in the corner, its wooden frame dulled with age, its keys slightly yellowed. "Charlie," she called, "let's see what you can do." The room shifted. A few students exchanged looks. Someone snickered. Trevor, sitting nearby, shot him a quick glance. Part concern, part curiosity. Charlie didn't move right away. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. His heartbeat wasn't fast, but it was strong. Then he stood. A few muffled laughs rippled through the classroom as he walked toward the piano. Someone muttered something under their breath, but Charlie didn't care enough to catch it. He already knew the tone. Mrs. Langley clasped her hands together. "Play whatever you'd like." Charlie studied the piano. He could tell just by looking at it. The soundboard was probably warped, some of the hammers weak. It wouldn't be perfect, but perfection wasn't the goal. He sat down, resting his hand on the keys, feeling their weight beneath his fingers. Then someone laughed, low, smug. And just like that, the moment changed. It wasn't about Mrs. Langley anymore. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving everyone wrong. Charlie inhaled. Then he played. The first few notes drifted into the air, soft and steady. A blues progression, the kind his grandfather used to play on humid summer nights in New Orleans. The laughter stopped. Charlie's fingers moved effortlessly, rolling through chords with confidence, his left hand keeping time while his right danced over the melody. The energy in the room shifted. No one was whispering now. No one was snickering. Even Mrs. Langley, who always carried herself with an air of certainty, had furrowed her brows ever so slightly. She had expected hesitation, a shaky start, a mistake. Instead, she got something else entirely. Charlie didn't look at them. He didn't care about their faces, their reactions. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. The music grew deeper, richer. His hands moved faster, shifting into something more complex, a progression his grandfather had drilled into him over and over until he had mastered it. His fingers ran up and down the keys, blending notes that clashed and resolved in perfect harmony. The silence in the room grew heavier. Trevor leaned forward slightly, eyes wide. A few kids who had cracked jokes earlier now sat frozen, their mouths slightly open. Mrs. Langley's arms remained crossed, but her fingers twitched ever so slightly against her sleeve. She hadn't expected this. Then the crescendo. Charlie pressed firmly against the keys, striking chords that filled every inch of the room, leaving no space for doubt. The final note rang out, long, powerful, undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. Then a single clap from the back of the room, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Trevor let out a low whistle. Damn! Even Brandon, the loudmouth of the class, shook his head. I didn't know he could do that. Charlie exhaled, his hands still resting on the keys. His heart wasn't pounding. He wasn't nervous. Because this wasn't about showing off. This was about being heard. And now they had no choice but to listen. The applause still hung in the air, but Mrs. Langley hadn't moved. Charlie Henderson sat at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys, his breathing steady. Around him, the room buzzed with a new kind of energy, a mix of shock, admiration, and something else, respect. Trevor gave him a slow nod, one that didn't need words. A few other students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to genuine surprise. Even Brandon, who always had something to say, stayed quiet, just shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. But Mrs. Langley's silence was the loudest of all. She stood near her desk, arms still crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't even reacting. For the first time all year, she looked unsure. Finally, she spoke. Well, she said, her voice clipped, almost forced. That was unexpected. The clapping slowed, and students looked back and forth between her and Charlie. A few kids still whispered excitedly, but the balance in the room had shifted. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Charlie met her gaze, unflinching. My grandfather. Something flickered in her expression. Something quick, something unreadable. Then just as fast, she buried it. I see. A pause. She tapped her fingers against the desk, the only sound in the now silent room, then straightened her posture. All right, she said, clearing her throat. Let's get back to the lesson. But nobody moved. Charlie glanced around. Trevor was still watching him. Madison Green, a girl who had barely spoken to him all year, had her arms crossed, looking almost annoyed, like she wasn't ready for the moment to be over. Then Brandon scoffed under his breath. That's it. Mrs. Langley's eyes snapped toward him. Excuse me? Brandon shrugged. I mean, that's all you're gonna say? He just played like, he gestured vaguely, something off a record, and you're just gonna move on? A few quiet agreements rippled through the room. Mrs. Langley's grip on her book tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Charlie took a slow breath, steadying himself. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes darted back to him, sharp and assessing. She didn't respond. Charlie didn't let her look away. That's why you called me up here. More whispers. Mrs. Langley let out a slow breath. I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class. Charlie shook his head. No, you didn't. Her fingers curled slightly against the desk. That's enough, Charlie. But he wasn't done. You wouldn't have asked Trevor, he continued, glancing at his friend, or Madison, or Brandon. His voice remained calm. But you asked me, why? The room held its breath. Mrs. Langley's jaw tightened. Sit down. For the first time all year, Charlie didn't immediately do as he was told. He looked around the room at his classmates, the ones who had ignored him before, the ones who had underestimated him, the ones who had smirked when she called his name. Then slowly he stood up from the piano. The silence was thick now, charged. And Mrs. Langley, for all her usual control, looked just a little bit shaken. Charlie Henderson stood beside the piano, his hands steady at his sides, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room. The energy had shifted. Everyone felt it. Mrs. Langley, standing rigidly near her desk, tried to regain control, but something had cracked. For once, she wasn't the one in charge. The silence stretched, thick and unmoving, as if the entire class was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Brandon spoke again. "That's really it?" He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Man plays like that, and you just want to move on." A few other students murmured in agreement. Some nodded. Even Madison Green, who rarely engaged in classroom discussions, crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Langley's fingers curled against the desk. "This is a history class, not a music lesson." Brandon scoffed. "That's not what this was about, though. We all know it." The room buzzed with something unspoken but undeniable. The feeling that everyone had seen behind the curtain, that the power she held so tightly had just slipped. Charlie exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on hers. "You didn't think I could do it," he said, his voice even. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Mrs. Langley's eyes narrowed. "Charlie, that's enough." But Charlie wasn't done. "You called me up here because you thought I'd mess up," he continued, his tone measured, steady. "You thought I'd embarrass myself. You wanted to prove something." More whispers rippled through the classroom. A few students shifted in their seats, stealing glances at one another. Mrs. Langley's jaw tightened. "That is not true." Charlie didn't blink. "Then why me?" Silence. Trevor, sitting at the front, looked between them. He didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. He knew the answer, too. Charlie let the quiet stretch before speaking again. "You wouldn't have asked anyone else to do this." His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Not Trevor, not Madison, not Brandon." He let that settle. "Just me." Mrs. Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're out of line." Charlie tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" A few quiet gasps rippled through the room. Someone at the back let out a low whistle. Mrs. Langley inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders, trying to pull herself back into the authority she had commanded just minutes ago. "Sit down, Charlie," she said, her voice clipped. For the first time all year, he didn't move right away. He looked around the room, at his classmates, at the ones who had ignored him before, the ones who had underestimated him. And he saw it. They were seeing her differently now. That was enough. Finally, he turned, walking back to his seat slowly, deliberately. As he sank into his chair, Trevor leaned over, whispering just loud enough for him to hear, "Dude, you just flipped everything upside down." Charlie let out a slow breath. "Yeah." He glanced back at Mrs. Langley, who had turned to her lesson plan, pretending as if nothing had happened. But nothing was the same anymore. The bell rang, but the usual rush to the door didn't happen. Students moved slower, still glancing toward Charlie Henderson, as if seeing him for the first time. Something had shifted. Mrs. Langley didn't look at him as she gathered her books. She didn't have to. She knew. Charlie slung his backpack over his shoulder and stepped into the hallway. The usual noise of lockers slamming and sneakers squeaking against tile filled the air. But there was an undercurrent of something different. Recognition. "Man, that was wild," Trevor said, catching up to him. "I mean, you just—" He shook his head, grinning. "You didn't even yell, but you still made her look." "Yeah," Charlie said simply. He didn't need to hear the rest. He had felt it. As they walked toward the cafeteria, a few students who had never spoken to him before nodded in acknowledgement. Madison Green, always distant, sat down across from him at lunch. "Didn't know you had that in you," she admitted. "The way you played. I mean, that was something else." Charlie shrugged. "Guess there's a lot people don't know." From across the cafeteria, Mrs. Langley passed by, tray in hand. Their eyes met for half a second before she looked away first. Charlie just kept eating, because today he didn't have to prove anything. They already knew. That evening, Charlie Henderson walked home feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The sun hung low in the sky, stretching shadows across the cracked pavement. The air smelled like cut grass and fried catfish from a nearby house. At the corner store, Mr. Henson, the old man who ran the place, watched him with knowing eyes. "You look like a kid who just did something important," he said, leaning on the counter. Charlie hesitated, then smirked. "Maybe I did." By the time he stepped into the house, his mother was at the stove, humming softly as she flipped a skillet of cornbread. She didn't turn around. "You're home late," she said. Charlie dropped his backpack by the door and sat at the kitchen table. "Had a long day." His mother finally glanced over, her eyes sharp but warm. "Good or bad?" Charlie thought about it. About the silence after he played. About the way the class had seen him differently. About Mrs. Langley looking away first. "Good," he said. "Really good." His mother wiped her hands on a towel and sat across from him. "You want to tell me about it?" So he did. She listened, nodding, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and something else. Something softer. When he finished, she sighed. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." Charlie nodded. "I think I was supposed to." His mother smiled. "Good. Because some lessons aren't in books. Some moments change everything. And today, Charlie had made sure they would never see him the same way again.